Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Professor Ines and Professor Hassan. It's a great honor to be with you, and I thoroughly enjoyed Ria's presentation. So I'm now trying to go back to basics of what we do every day in diabetes. I will try to, the objective of my presentation would be to look into the prevalence of diabetes in our region, understand the link between HbA1c and complications, and understand the glycemic control attained in our region as well as globally, and specifically looking into patients with high risk as well, glycemic control. Now, starting with Egypt, I had the pleasure to be part of the group from Alexandria that looked into the prevalence of diabetes in Alexandria as a representative of the country because of the demography of Alexandria, including urban, rural, and even Bedouin population. And it's important to understand our population. Our population do very little exercise, as you can see from the information here. Nearly 50% says they do no exercise. And about 3/4 of our population are either overweight or obese, where obesity is 40% with a BMI of above 30. And also, we have the disadvantage of very high levels of smoking. I can share with you data from other countries where people with diabetes smoking level is around less than 10%. But in our country, in Egypt, smoking is really pretty high, and that obviously is a cause of concern. You have probably seen this data presented before, but the prevalence of diabetes in Alexandria as a representative of Egypt was overall 16.8%, with females more than males. And it varied according to the age group, but in general, it was pretty equal in both. But the previous slide also tells us a very important point that I think all of you know very well. One is that almost 1 in 2 people in their 60s have diabetes. But the other very disturbing point is we do have diabetes, or a fair amount, even in people in their teenage and their early 20s. So when I compare this with the data that we've published in Dubai, following a WHO steps-wise survey, and from 2014 and 2017, the overall prevalence of diabetes is 15.2%, with another 15% having prediabetes. Now, the latest survey done 2019 and published just last year is more or less the same, where the total average is around 13.7%. In Emiratis, more than expats. And a good percentage, although less than before, are newly diagnosed during the survey. They did not know that they have diabetes. And again, the same message. As we get into the 60s, nearly 1 in 2 people will have diabetes. And obviously, age is a risk factor for many other problems. And diabetes is a condition that should not be taken lightly. Definitely, it's not mild condition. With all the neuropathy, the vascular problems, the renal problem, the retinal problems, and the cardiac problems, then we get lots of hospitalization and premature death. But we know from many data, and specifically the focus is on the UQPDS. Why? Because that was early intervention at the time of diagnosis. At the time of diagnosis, if we are to intervene early, then microvascular complications will improve, will go down from that level to that level. Macrovascular complications improved, but we all know that this needed longer time and the level of reduction was not as high. Having said that, it also has impact. So, what do we really need to do? What should be the objective of our treatments? Now, this is a photo from our beautiful Nile in Aswan, and I thought this is just a relaxing moment for us to reflect on we really need to hit the targets, every single target. We treat the person as a whole, not just the eyes or the kidney or the nerves or the retina. We treat a human being with all the targets that need to be achieved. That needs to be done with maximum adherence and tolerability, and at the end of the day, improving quality of life and survival. The question is, are we achieving these levels? Are we achieving good control? Now, as you all know, I currently work in Dubai Health Authority, a governmental body that looks after a large number of people. And the infrastructure is very good. So when you look into our cohort of patients, we had a large number of patients in our cohort, over 25 or 26,000 persons in this cohort, where 23,800 of them were type 2 diabetes. And the data that for over 5 years are saying to us is, despite all the very solid infrastructure, around 40% at best are achieving the perfect control of HbA1c less than 7. And the other 60% are between 7 to 9 or even above 9. Now, that's obviously is a cause of concern. When we looked into whether it is related to nationality, there was no difference. So the problem is there regardless of culture or wealth. It's everyone more or less the same. Of course, people with type 1 diabetes have worse control. So far much less people with type 1 diabetes, perhaps because of the link with the insulin hypoglycemia, are achieving the low HbA1c. But the problem obviously with type 1 is here, as you can see, far too many with HbA1c above 9. Now, when you look into age groups, now we know that young people and teenage are usually difficult to control. And as you can see here, that when you look into those in green, which is below the age of 20, you would find very little of well control and much higher of poor control. Whereas we get older, into their 20s and then into their 40s and certainly above 60, it looks like the older we get, the better the control. Because as you can see here in yellow, above 65 was very less HbA1c above 9 in comparison to those who are below 7 HbA1c or between 7 to 9. I have to admit that this data is not propensity score adjusted, so perhaps there are other contributing factors. Now, it's important to think not just of the overall population. Now, of course, a person with cardiovascular or renal problems are more at risk, and it's important to try to get their parameters better. When we look into HbA1c for those people who are at high risk because of cardiovascular or renal problems, then you would find that more or less we are seeing the same pattern. Not many people are achieving the perfect control over the years. And when you look into LDL, for example, a very important parameter for patients at high risk because of vascular or renal problem, regardless of type 1 or type 2 diabetes, here is the LDL. So they need the statin or other therapy if required. And over the years, there is a mild increase in the level of achieving LDL of below 70. Perhaps to be fair to the colleagues, that was not the target at the time. The target was below 100. So perhaps that's why the treatment was not intensified enough. Now, we looked again into recent data on patients with retinopathy to try to understand how well we're doing with this high group. And if you look into the mean HbA1c of those with retinopathy, perhaps that's why they have retinopathy, their average HbA1c is higher than those without. And the proportion of them achieving good control of less than 7 is just about a third, with another 30% between 7 to 8. So there is a good opportunity to change many to this, because 1% improvement is not as difficult as 2 or 3% improvement. If I were to look into the percentage of getting all of the KPIs, the key performance indices for this very high-risk group with diabetic retinopathy, you will see that triglycerides, which are an important point for retinopathy, below 100 is only 34%. LDL is about a third. The best parameters were for blood pressure, specifically diastolic, below 80 was 85%, and below 130 is 43%. HbA1c, as I've mentioned earlier, was just about a third getting to the target HbA1c. So I have shown you data on the general patients with diabetes, whether type 1 or type 2. I've shown you data on our patients who have cardiac or renal problems, and this is the data of patients with retinal problems. So clearly, glycemic control, and to an extent, other parameters are, as well, need to improve. When I look across the region, the MENA region here, more or less the same outcome is there. Studies from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, from Qatar, from Palestine are all showing more or less the same problem. We are not alone, because actually globally, this is more or less the same. Here is the percentage of patients who are achieving the target, mortar target of less than 6.5 of 31%. And that's in many European countries with a very strong established system that we do not have in any of our regional countries, even in the Gulf countries. So there is something missing, although in the last number of years, we had huge number of therapies. This is data from Germany. And as you can see here, still more or less, although obviously the German data from this cohort looks a bit better, that 54% are achieving HbA1c of less than 7, but that was perhaps one of the centers rather than generalized. So, in summary, we have an explosion of type 2 diabetes in our region, plus an explosion in prediabetes and obesity. This is largely to do with our lifestyle, where physical activity, obesity, as well as smoking are very high. At the time of diagnosis, half of type 2 diabetes patients have one or more of the diabetes-related complications, as we all know from many established data. Of course, type 2 diabetes increases the risk of cardiovascular and renal problems, as well as all the other complications. But also, the point that we always should remember, that lowering the blood glucose can further improve all of these complications, and we have tonight seen with the Professor Riyad's presentation as well, this can also improve neuropathy, the most common complications we have in diabetes in our region. Diabetes-related complications could be prevented or delayed by careful management of glycemic control. A sizable proportion of our patients do need to have better treatment related to their complications so that we can get to control better. And of course, we need to look into measures beyond glycemic control for all people with diabetes. And with this, I'll leave you with another picture from our beloved mind. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Mohamed, for this elegant, updated, illustrated lecture. And it shows that the magnitude of the problem is the same in the Middle East and the Gulf and even worldwide. And we wish all the politicians and the decision makers are to have any action to, I think, prevent diabetes and prevent complications rather than to treat it. Any questions from the floor? Thank you, Dr. Mohamed, and we wish you a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll move for the last lecture in this session. It will be from